The incredible post offices that mark the power of the United States. The United States, a nation that defies all expectations, an amalgamation of different cultures and peoples, all built in under a 100-year period, its territories completely defined, cities built where no cities had existed before. And today this nation exists as arguably a hyperpower within international affairs. But what's the real story of the origin behind the United States? How was it its borders were all defined for all of its states by 1874, with the Dakotas being an exception, and the numerous expositions? It even had a national capital constructed, and then it was reconstructed during the Civil War, no less. Join me as we explore the truth of America. The United States of America, the great state. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. We're going to explore the origins of the United States, the world's hyperpower. How did this colonial breakaway from the British Empire become the hyperpower that it is today? Come join me as we explore the American Republic.
This isn't an ordinary fight. This is a fight between the powers of light and darkness.
We've extensively explored the United States in our explorations, and we're going to examine this rail map from 1875 when it was composed, and it was originally composed to celebrate the centennial of the United States. And you might be surprised to know that the United States was already completely divided out by 1875 when this map was made, and it includes the United States and the Dominion of Canada at the time. And we can see that it includes the wondrous infrastructure that had to be completed to support the railroad. Everywhere at the same time, the United States was rapidly constructed, and here we see an image of the differing United States Capitol domes, supposedly. It's also intriguing to realize that the geographical definitions of all the states seem to have been defined, and we had many centennials and World's Fairs that had already transpired at this time, according to the official history. We can see that the fine geographical definitions of the states were already established. It's almost as though there was some sort of preconceived plan, and indeed the only states not divided in this map are the Dakotas into North and South Dakota, but everything else is as we know it now. We looked at certain states, such as Georgia, and we consider the early history of Georgia, namely the capital of Atlanta. Atlanta did not exist, really, prior to 1800 at all. It was a rail stop that was suddenly built up, destroyed in the Civil War by the Union Army, and then quickly rebuilt after the Civil War. It's an all too common story that we have. And indeed, most of the cities that we've explored in the United States didn't even exist before 1800, or they were simple settlements or forts, such as Nashville in Tennessee, another city that grew rapidly in the 1800s. And we've explored elsewhere across the eastern United States, such as Louisville, where we've seen wondrous architecture, and again, another city that rapidly developed and grew in the 1800s. And I don't want to forget to mention Cincinnati, one of my favorite explorations, where we saw a city that we're told was made by Germans, and Indianapolis in Indiana, a city that seems to be a terminus point. And of course, who can forget Chicago, where they had the Great World's Fair and several fires. So many cities that developed in the 1800s, to include Milwaukee with this wondrous courthouse and the large convent, visible from the river very easily. And going over to Minnesota and Minneapolis and St. Paul, two cities that grew very quickly. And indeed, many of these cities grew rapidly. We have courthouses, and we have Rochester in Minnesota, where the Mayo Clinic developed, and this wondrous courthouse in Austin, Minnesota. Of course, we see the brutalist example that remains to this day. And looking across this map, we can see that all these structures were completed at the same time. State capitals, county courthouses, infrastructure, railways, all done within the 1800s. Our favorite Iowa State Capitol, or at least my favorite, maybe you don't like it, and that's entirely okay. And yet, the presence of Iowa State College at Ames, and yet Ames, Iowa is not depicted on this map, even though it was originally constructed as a rail stop. Very interesting. We go out to Nebraska on the Transcontinental Railroad, and we can see the many communities that were along it, and maybe even see Gene Hackman when he thought he was dead, but he was actually just in Nebraska. I don't have anything against Nebraska. We can see, though, that the Dakotas have no infrastructure depicted in them, no railroads, and yet they rapidly grew. recall our exploration of Mount Rushmore and Devil's Tower and seeing the top of Devil's Tower in what is today Wyoming. And even back when this map was constructed, it was very clearly Wyoming. So many interesting things and wondrous achievements in a short 100-year period. And over here on this map, we even have some population figures and railway distribution in terms of how much mileage in each state. It's a very impressive set of achievements that's all illustrated on one map. Remember that the United States was a breakaway colonial possession of the British Empire. There was no reason for this wondrous experiment, at least we're told it was an experiment in government, to suddenly succeed. And not only did it succeed, it rapidly grew in under 100 years. All this infrastructure, all these bridges, all these railroads, all these state capitals, even the U.S. state capitol, the courthouses, and let's not forget the population. And you can certainly go back and look at the population video to see how unprecedented the growth of population in the United States is. Many will try to explain it by simply saying it was because of immigration. We also have our early governors and some very interesting early governors, such as C.C. Carpenter, the governor of Iowa, in the 1870s. Isn't it intriguing that they wanted to make sure everybody knew who the governor was and what their term was, even during this time frame? And who is the individual who made this map? Gaylord Watson? Did Gaylord Watson appear like Ben Stiller? Because we don't have an image of Gaylord Watson, which I find quite fascinating, and yet this was an official map that was logged in the Library of Congress. So what to make of this impressive map that shows us the incredible achievements of the American Republic in under 100 years? It's very impressive if it's taken at face value. But is this really to be taken at face value? Let's examine what the United States has become. And we went from a backwater colony to the world power, and that's depicted here in the Unified Combatant Command's area of responsibility, where the United States Department of Defense has divided up every geographical area in the known land, the world, the realm, whatever you want to call it, into geographical areas of responsibility, even violating the Posse Comitatus Act, which says that military cannot be used in a law enforcement role, but we're told that U.S. Northern Command was a practical necessity due to matters of national security, and therefore it exists. So regardless of concerns in earlier American times, they have Northern Command. They have a command that encompasses every single geographical area. And the intention behind this is so that there can be a division and a unified chain of command for the employment of American military forces anywhere in the land. Indeed, the United States is the only military in the world that divides up the entire world into geographical areas of responsibility. It's also the only military in the world, as far as we know, that has what's called expeditionary capability, the ability to deploy military forces to any point in the land. They even have a space command area. Now, whatever your opinion on this is quite an amazing change from what was just a group of colonies that was considered a backwater area. And there's even a book that's been written called Flight of the Eagle by this particular individual, Conrad Black, Lord Black, who is considered somewhat controversial himself. But whatever your opinion on the individual, this is the only novel or book that considers the strategy from America's rise. And we look at the founding fathers of the United States, the founding fathers which seem to have even come to a mythical status. And officially we're told the founding fathers were the signers of the Declaration of Independence, the composers of the Constitution, although we specify things a little bit more. We have George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and a few others. Oh, I don't want to forget Alexander Hamilton. But these were the individuals who had these wondrous thoughts of creating a republic, a democracy. Even though things started to change, if we look at the 5 pillars of the original American Republic, we have faith in God, respect for the Bible, sinfulness of human nature, Christian virtue necessary, and government exists to protect faith and freedom. That's very different than the other aspects or perceptions that we have of the modern American state, where we say we believe in the separation of church and state. But of course, we understand that things were very different. People thought and operated very differently at that time. At least that's what we're told. Regardless, though, we have this conflicting account with the nascency of the United States. We also have many of these mythological images and these symbols that are so powerful. Lady Columbia, the Statue of Liberty, Uncle Sam. And yet when you look at a lot of the artwork that we've seen in many of these wonderful structures that were constructed in the United States, we see many mythical impersonations and even what would be considered folk art, such as this image where we see people paying their taxes. And I thought it was very fitting since it's April in the United States, and everyone in the United States knows what April means, unless of course you file for an extension. The symbolism is very interesting, though, with Lady Columbia and the aspects of innate wisdom. It almost reflects something that we could consider from the Greco-Roman pantheon of deities. Why do we see this so present in the United States? And indeed, in all the state capital explorations that we've done, we've seen some sort of reference to this symbolism, not symbology, but symbolism. And we've even seen it in many county courthouses and in other areas across the land. Indeed, every soldier and sailor's monument that we've looked at shows this symbolism to an extent. But what is this really reflecting? It's almost as though this is pointing back to another period of American history. Now, of course, we'll be told, no, that's not true. It's merely a sign of symbols that alludes to the myth and the folk art that represents what the United States was truly about. Consider the Lewis and Clark expedition. The United States doubled in size when it had the Louisiana Purchase, when it purchased that area from France. And President Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark, two U.S. Army officers, on an expedition to the Pacific to map out the terrain. Oddly enough, the French, who had been there for hundreds of years, had never bothered to map it out, or perhaps Napoleon didn't want to throw maps in the deal and just wanted to sell the land as fast as he could. Although it's now understood that what selling the land meant was that the United States could actually go and, how shall we say, occupy it, but we'll just call it what it is, conquer it, as there were Native Americans that were there, and we have the account of their guide, Sacagawea, and there were many other guides that supposedly took part in the Lewis and Clark expedition. But what was the real intention behind it? Do you just send a small party to go and explore and actually bypass a lot of the land that you're in, or were they looking for something else? There's a lot of anomalies when you go through this particular path that these individuals traveled on, and what's the real historicity behind this? Now, there's a lot of debate between the purposes of this expedition. It has been agreed upon, but if you ever go to Montana, you'll find that there's a lot of interesting sites that are there. Now, of course, we'll be told that these are just simple natural rock formations and that Montana is a very beautiful state, and there's certainly no arguing that point. Yet if you ever travel through it, you'll find that there's many of these odd examples with rocks, or rocks that some might be forgiven for thinking are not necessarily built by nature. There's many supposed surviving maps and first-hand accounts of the Lewis and Clark expedition, such as this, less than well-kept manner of notes in a map. That gives you the idea of what their expedition was really about and what they were focused on. And then you have other maps that were obviously more well-decorated and, how shall we say, well-composed, with more effort being put into scientific and accuracy with the distances and the locations and in terms of what they were researching. This is the Sergeant Floyd Memorial, and a very strange obelisk that exists near Sioux City, Iowa. And you might be surprised to know that there is something that is a smaller version of an obelisk of the Great Washington Monument in Sioux City, Iowa. Oddly enough, there's still the little commemoration that we have on it. They call it a shaft, and it's to mark the burial place of Sergeant Charles Floyd of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Died in his country's service, buried 1804. And then we see that graves of such men are pilgrim shrines, no class or creed confined. And it was erected in 1900 by the Floyd Memorial Association, United States and the state of Iowa. Very interesting, again, an almost mythical association with this incredible structure that still exists near Sioux City. They built this in 1900. Well, how come every set of veterans, especially from the Great War and then the War to End All Wars, which is the same war in World War II, didn't get such wonderful monuments such as this? Well, this was Sergeant Floyd from the Lewis and Clark expedition, and I suppose for some reason he deserved a great obelisk, and I'm certainly not denigrating the character of his service. I'm just saying it's a very impressive monument for one single individual. And yet we do have some construction photos of it, if you can call this a construction photo. Maybe you can. There's some peculiarities with it where it shows them allegedly finishing constructing the top of the monument. You'd think there'd be a better quality photo in 1900, but I don't know, maybe they just didn't have a very good camera at that time. And you can see, though, on the early maps at the end of the expedition, they still had Floyd's grave marked. Well, I guess the officers were very fond of this Sergeant Floyd. He really did his job quite well. I think of all the other non-commissioned officers, though, that have lost their lives in the service of the United States. There's many other aspects that reflect the myth and the folk art of the United States from the 1800s, and they give the impression of the concept of what was called manifest destiny, Yes, manifest destiny, apparently a strategic influence or a strategic goal of the United States to settle all the lands from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It's really hard to pinpoint, though, the actual origin of this strategy. You could almost say that it almost seemed preordained, and indeed, manifest destiny almost says it's preordained. And indeed, the individual that coined the term, we don't actually have a picture of him, we just have a sketch drawing of Mr. John O'Sullivan. I find that very interesting, that the individual that coined the term for a mythical strategic expansion westward. And we do have the same kind of symbolism that accompanies it, with deities and the overwatching of the settlers as they moved west into areas that were untamed with infinite amounts of resources and land. At least that's what we'll be expected to believe. And it's rather fascinating that on many of these images you'll see trains and tracks, and then you'll also see trains that are traveling across open land without tracks. So is that to give us the impression that they had to build the train tracks rather rapidly, or was it just artistic license? Not really sure, but it's interesting that that's what we have. We have a lot of paintings and a lot of mythology that accompanies this, even though the camera had been invented and was fully in use during the Civil War. Although we always lament our complete lack of combat photographs, that doesn't necessarily prove or disprove anything, any more than the lack of photographs that really display manifest destiny really prove or disprove anything. Of course, people will say that if you just have an image of a small western town or one of those shack towns of wood in South Dakota, which we've explored and we have some interesting accounts behind, it gives another conflicting account. Ah, yes, Lady Columbia, who can forget, the great deity of the United States. It's very fascinating that we have this Lady Columbia, or the Statue of the Republic as it was called in the Chicago World's Fair in the early 1890s. Once again, almost showing a completely different origin for the United States. Are we to simply take these as national symbols, or was there some other inspiration behind their creation? Why are they so prevalent, especially in buildings? It's one thing to do drawings and paintings of all this, but when you lay out manifest destiny and the fact that all these structures were built very quickly in a short time frame in the 1800s, they all display these symbols. Now, of course, we have our theories that this could potentially represent a different origin for the United States. And perhaps that's what we really have to consider, that there is a different ideological origin. We'll be told that the roots of the American Republic or democracy actually come from the Greek originals, or the practice of democracy in Athens, and even the Roman Republic. And yet, oddly enough, we do see a combination of symbols that give us different indications for what manifest destiny really led to. And indeed, now the United States has a reputation for being a nation of excess, and yet it still claims to defend and support democracy. Here's a chart showing the estimated number of pioneers departing for Oregon, and you might recall our exploration of Seattle, where we saw a very tremendous growth of population within that particular area of the country. The population growth of Seattle from 1860 to 1960. And we're supposed to take this mythological interpretation of paintings and drawings along with these official documents and brochures that encouraged everybody to go west. Because you went through a hard journey to come to the United States from Europe, so you may as well go on another hard journey to go out west and tame this untamed land where there was no existing infrastructure at the time. And indeed, the railroad map is quite limited in terms of how much railway mileage there was in the United States in 1875. Of course, in the next 30 years, they quickly increased that exponentially, and let's not forget our changing of the rail gauge of 11,500 miles of rail in 36 hours. But remember, it was the 1800s. There really weren't any logistical limitations. They managed to build all this infrastructure, all these railways, all of these bridges, and all of these tunnels in a very short amount of time, as the map does indicate. 1776 to 1876. A series of wondrous achievements. A nation that not only was brought about by being a breakaway colony, and consider the wars that this nation fought. The War of 1812, constant conflicts with Native Americans, the Mexican War, and the U.S. Civil War. We saw the United States military struggle quite a bit in the War of 1812, and indeed it frequently struggled in its conflicts with the Native Americans. The legend of the last stand of Custer endures to this day. Somehow they managed to improve, though, in the Mexican War and then in the U.S. Civil War. The point being is that there were a series of very brutal conflicts, and Yet it seems that the United States had its strategic mentality in mind, and that the United States Civil War was going to be fought so that the United States could achieve a more perfect democracy, and coincidentally it could also achieve a more centralized government. But let's think about that, because we're told that prior to the United States Civil War that the American states, such as Iowa, Georgia, they were really the representation. It's in the title of the United States. That, in other words, state identity or states' rights were what mattered to people. Well, perhaps the best way to look at that is in flags, and we're told that the United States needed to have a flag in 1777, and here we have George Washington with Betsy Ross approving the original design. But what exactly did the states have in the early period of the United States? So we would expect every single state in the United States to have a state flag, especially once they became a state, but you may be surprised to know that that's not the case. For example, we'll look at Minnesota in 1893, the first Minnesota state flag. In 1893, the Minnesota delegation to the Chicago World's Fair held a contest under the auspices of the state legislature to design a Minnesota state flag. The flag was intended to serve as a promotional tool for the state at its exhibition pavilion in Chicago. Amelia Hyde, Center of Minneapolis, submitted the winning entry. So we have a competition for our state flags, and I'm rather surprised to know that they didn't have a state flag for Minnesota. What about the Civil War? Well, when you look up here on this site, you're told that Minnesota's Civil War battle flags, in keeping with Union customs, several Minnesota regiments carried blue battle flags with a state seal in the center, including the 1st Minnesota, which fought at Gettysburg and endured great casualties, but certainly not because of General Hancock, and the 2nd, 4th, and 5th Minnesota. Most other Minnesota battle flags, however, had the American Eagle at the center by federal regulations. Many of Minnesota's battle flags are today displayed in the Capitol Rotunda. Well, that's Minnesota. Let's look at Iowa. Iowa was one of the primary states of the Union and sent nearly 10% of its population to fight in the Civil War, the war between the states. What's the origin of its flag? Well, they didn't have their flag until 1921. What? Iowa did not have a state flag until 1921? That's what official history says. There was a false flag that was apparently used by a tobacco company, but it wasn't the real official flag of Iowa. So let me get this straight. Iowa, one of the most, how shall we say, supportive states of the Union, and yet we're told that prior to the Civil War, states' rights and states' identity was so paramount, didn't even have a state flag until the 1920s. They didn't even have one for the World's Fair, and we know that Iowa had some great displays in the Chicago World's Fair, but they didn't have a state flag. How would anybody know about Iowa? Let's look at one of the southern states or former states of the Confederacy and the flag of Georgia. And indeed, you'll find that Georgia didn't actually have a state flag or anything like it until 1861. This is very strange. Well, let's just look at a timeline of all U.S. state flags, and you might be surprised to notice that virtually all of the U.S. states did not have any kind of state flag until the 1860s, which corresponded with the start of the Civil War. And indeed, you'll see that most of the states that did were the states that joined the Confederacy or seceded from the Union. Now, there are some exceptions, such as Hawaii and maybe a few others. New York, but of course, New York being the original port of entry to the United States and it being around since the 1600s, of course it would have a flag. But for the most part, none of the states had any sort of state flag until the 1860s. This seems to be in contravention towards what we'd expect with the identity of the states in the United States. So what's the point behind all this? The point behind all this is that despite having the paramounts of symbolism, none of the states bothered to have state flags. The United States had to have its flag for the American Revolution, though, but the states supposedly had this great identity, but for the most part, it didn't develop until the 1860s. That seems to give us a very different perception than what we're taught about the identity of the American states. But what are your thoughts on this discrepancy that we found? So let's close this exploration by looking at the works of Erastus Salisbury Field, an American folk painter, and this is supposedly a colorized daguerreotype. Does this really look like any kind of picture to you, though? Very strange, and this individual is considered an American folk painter, and he was primarily active from 1850 to 1870, although the exact datings of his works are quite interesting. What kind of picture does he give us of America? Well, when you look at some of his works, he has a very interesting style of realism mixed with some sort of aspect of idealism. And you're probably asking, all right, why are we looking at an American folk painter? Because folk art is something that it's not necessarily a true reflection of what's actually going on. It's merely showing us exactly what we have in terms of myth. Indeed, we're told that he focused a lot of his works on biblical and classical paintings, such as the Ark depicted here. Now, if we go off the official account, then sure, we could easily believe that, but this individual also painted aspects of American history. And so could this give us the impression that the Ark of the Covenant was in the United States at some point in time? Now, I could simply be leaping to conclusions and there may be no reality behind it, but it's quite an interesting body of work that this field provided us, or whatever his works was really representing, or were representing. This family portrait is rather interesting as well, and seeing some of the humanity in the images and yet some of the idealism. Isn't it intriguing when we think of what our perceptions of the 1800s are really like, and how do we form our perceptions of the 1800s? Well, I hate to say it, but the reality is it's from television shows, it's from certain paintings, and we'll look at folk art such as this, and this is where we'll derive our understanding of history from, because this actually puts it in image. And as we're constantly told, oddly enough by the United States Department of Defense as well, we're all visual learners. And so what are these images really representing? Is this the idealized individual from the 1800s? And indeed, he even did this interesting image that shows George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and some of the great Union generals, I say that with a little bit of sarcasm, from the United States Civil War, because while the military record of Ulysses S. Grant, who's depicted here, some of the other generals depicted on this painting don't exactly have the greatest reputation. Yes, of course, we have the old hand in the pocket. Why not? Very interesting representation, though, of Lincoln and Washington, and not typically how we're used to seeing them. Now, is this supposed to be some sort of real image, or is this just some sort of idealized image? And who do we have over here to the right? Well, this is supposed to be General Ambrose Burnside on the far right. Why is it we always have this reference to Ambrose Burnside? Because his military record during the United States Civil War was anything but remotely close to successful. Indeed, one of the most bloody, horrific Union defeats in the Civil War, the Battle of Fredericksburg, was brought about by this individual. There's also other odd artwork that Mr. Field did, such as the Taj Mahal. Was there a Taj Mahal in the United States, or did he actually travel to India? Well, there's no real account of that, so why would he be doing an artistic rendering or look at the Taj Mahal? And then we look at some of his so-called biblical works, and yet we have another oddity with this, because is he really depicting biblical works? When you look closer at some of the detail behind this, though, there's nothing remotely biblical about this. This almost seems to give the impression of something a little bit more modern, or whatever was actually going on in the 1800s. Could it be that this is reflecting a different view of what truly transpired in the United States? Or again, is it just an ideal? Is it the fact that he really dabbled in different kinds of paintings and decided to do actual biblical representations and depictions, and also of Roman times? This is supposedly the army of the Pharaoh marching off, although how would anybody have any idea what the army of the Pharaoh marching off? And of course you'll tell me, well, he was just using his imagination. Of course he was. And speaking of his imagination, he did have a very unique painting called the Monument to the American Republic. This has to be one of the most unique and creative paintings I've ever seen from the 1800s. Where did this inspiration come from? Is this an amalgamation of different architectural stylings and paintings that he saw? Or does this represent something that may have existed in the United States? And again, I know you'll be saying speculation, but it's rather odd that during a time frame when people were certainly not encouraged to use their imaginations and had to be very pragmatic and very hard workers, because how else do you explain all that incredible infrastructure that was thrown up across the entire United States in under a 100-year period, then where was someone going off with their imagination being able to bring all this together? Or is it possible that this is a depiction of how something looked in the United States in the distant past? These very unique towers with all these columns. We're told that the artist was simply representing different folk art of America and showing American history. But why do they always call it the American Republic? And indeed, looking closer, you can see what's supposed to be historical events that are represented within the walls, on the columns, and yet we also still see the Roman Greco architecture. Well, you can easily hand-wave explain that away by saying, this particular individual, this painter, he liked to depict Roman and Greek origins in many of his paintings. So this doesn't necessarily reflect what was going on in the United States. But isn't it interesting we have such a conflicting account? What are your thoughts on the American Republic? What's the real history? Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Restituta Orbis channel. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to be exploring some of the mythical or legendary accounts across the land. We're oftentimes informed that the Native Americans were simply a hunter-gatherer society, and yet there's so many more details and so many more dimensions to the accounts of the Native Americans that we're going to consider in this exploration. They seem to be tied a little bit more closely to the land, and there are many more different origin accounts and legends that they possess through their oral traditions. Now, granted, as we explore these oral traditions, we're going to keep in mind that many may not have been transmitted to us directly. I would prefer to actually have a Native American account these lost tales of the old world to us directly, and if there's a demand, we'll do that. But I think there's some wonderful details that we need to consider as we explore the lost tales of the old world. We begin by examining the account of the Seti Ka, or the Siti Ka, there's many ways to pronounce it, a legendary group of people encountered by the Northern Paiute tribe, or the Northern Paiute people, who existed in Nevada, northwest Nevada to be exact. I'm always intrigued when we look at these images, though, that are ostensibly taken from the 1800s, at least again that's what we're informed of. What do they really communicate to us, though, about these people that existed during that time? There seem to be many unique traditions that are associated, and yet how much of this actually reaches us to this day? There always seems to be some odd figure that's in the background that is watching over many of these images. And what's really going on with a lot of this background? How developed is this civilization that they actually took this picture in? It paints many different conflicting images and accounts that we have, and one of the reasons that the Seti Ka are intriguing. Yes, this is the Seti Ka. I've always wanted to say that. Giants. Red-headed giants, anywhere from 8 to 10 feet tall. But there's conflicting accounts, and of course historians and scholars have looked at these oral traditions of the Northern Paiute people and have screened them, saying that, well, perhaps they merely encountered some people who were only taller, perhaps 6'9" or 6'10", but certainly not 8 to 10 feet tall. And yet there are numerous other accounts from Native American oral traditions that indicate the encounter with giants. Now, to be honest, in my travels I've never come across the bones of giants anywhere, and yet I've also never come across the bones of dinosaurs, so does that mean they don't exist either? I don't know. I leave it up for you to decide. But it's a very compelling account imagining what these people may have been faced with, and if they did indeed encounter actual giants, 8 to 10 feet tall or perhaps much larger, what was exactly the nature of this encounter? And who were these giants? Who were these Seti Ka that they encountered? And what methods or techniques did they come from with their particular civilization? How great of a threat were they to the Northern Paiute people? What sort of theories could we come up with to try to explain the presence of these incredible giants? Were they simply natural denizens of the land at that time in what we think of as northwest Nevada? Northwest Nevada is very interesting in and of itself, as it has many unique anomalies with it, along with these accounts that we have from the Northern Paiute people. And indeed, we even have such accounts as places such as Pyramid Lake, named by the great explorer Charles Fremont, and Pyramid Lake named because it has pyramids in it. Is there truth behind these accounts of these giants that were encountered, and the threats that they may have posed to the Northern Paiute people? And indeed other giants encountered in the central highlands of Mexico, and by other Native American groups, capturing and putting to death a giant. And why would they possess such a great threat? Well, could they have been some sort of remnant warrior that was brought about in the previous civilization? Or were they some sort of specialized hunter that was created through what we might think of as alchemical processes to hunt and terrorize the survivors of the last reset? And indeed, that seems to give us the impression of what's truly going on with many of the Native American oral traditions, that they had a better connection with the land and the other creatures that inhabited the land. And indeed, that's something that we see that rings true with all the Native American peoples and tribes that still exist to this day. Although we have conflicting accounts because mainstream studies, scholars, they try to go back and say that none of these accounts could be completely accurate. Perhaps it's simply exaggeration. It is oral tradition after all, and oral tradition is very easy to discredit because oral tradition does admit that there are multiple accounts because it's transmitted by somebody talking to another person, and Perhaps there could be something added to the message or subtracted from the message over time. Yet we look at the Lovelock Cave where this incident occurred in Nevada, or Nevada if you're in Iowa. Many different ways to pronounce the same word, which is always rather enjoyable. But you consider this very climactic account in this final decisive confrontation between the Northern Paiute and the Setika, or the Setike. And we look at other images, which, of course, we're told were debunked, and indeed many scholars have looked at this cave and this encounter, and they have certainly put their efforts into debunking the very existence of these giants. Of course, we don't know exactly when this encounter occurred, given our current chronological calendar, but we do have some idea that there are fossils and remains in these caves, but of course seeing them and actually analyzing them doesn't really give us any more answers. Is it possible that the Northern Paiute encountered these giants? It's very possible. Now, could it also be possible that they simply encountered a wandering band of strange people who had red hair and were on the higher range of 6 feet tall? That's possible as well. But I believe that there's a little bit more of accuracy and validity to this particular account, because when you have oral tradition, it's climactic events, memorable events that tend to be remembered and transmitted on the oral tradition. And even with the variances in the different accounts that you have with the encounter of the Setika, there's other tribes and other peoples across North America, and other lands as well, who've encountered giants. And yet it's always dismissed, it's always derided. Considering sacred sites across the land as well by various peoples and tribes and nations, it's also intriguing to me that we oftentimes look past Salton Lake, which is in Southern California. Salton Lake has many different accounts associated with it. Some even say that it could be a gateway, a portal to other lands, and others say that the Native Americans had many different accounts with it, stating that it could have been a path to darkness. Also, the origin accounts of these lands in Southern California are very intriguing, and whether we're talking about the Colorado Desert, the Mojave Desert, or the Sonoran Desert, or any of the other deserts in Southwest United States, there's always something interesting associated with them. This Salton Sea, or Salton Lake, or all the other names that it's had, always seems to have had an interesting history of development with it. Indeed, in the 20th century or the 1900s, the United States and the state of California attempted to develop this area. And it did not succeed for a variety of reasons that you can look up on your own, because it seems as though, once again, there's even conflicting accounts as soon as just a few decades ago. For whatever reason, the area is now mostly uninhabited, and there's all kinds of accounts of strange encounters. We also look at some of the brilliant landmarks in the southwestern desert, and whether we're driving through Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, or any of the other areas within the four-state, four-corner area where the ancestral Puebloans inhabited, although how real are the ancestral Puebloans? Did they really exist as the mainstream tells us they did? Are they connected with the actual oral traditions of the Native American nations and tribes that inhabited the area? It's subject to much debate. And you'll even come across great craters, such as the Great Crater. But what really caused it? Is it really from some meteorite or asteroid impact, as we might be expected to believe? And even the mountains, the Tetons, as you go into Wyoming. Going all across the land, you have these very interesting landmarks that seem to give the clue that there's something much more dramatic that was going on in this western area of the United States. And many people and defenders of the mainstream narrative will simply try to tell us that the Native Americans are proof that there was no civilization that existed prior to our civilization. And yet the same mainstream will tell us that, well, actually the Native Americans did have great civilizations of their own, and some of them even built pyramids. It just depends on what latitude you're at, whether you call them pyramids or whether you call them mounds. Such as the interesting account behind Mount Rushmore, which we explored. Are we talking about kings? Are we talking about Vikings? Are we talking about 6 grandfathers? We've explored it in detail before, but one thing I always found intriguing about the Black Hills area of South Dakota where Mount Rushmore is situated is the fact that all Native Americans in that area consider it a very holy and respected place. And as they said in the film Dances of Wolves, even our enemies agree that this is a special place. And if you examine the terrain anywhere around the Black Hills, or what is today called Custer National Park, you'll see that. There's scenes of immense serene beauty that one could lose oneself in. And it's very easy to understand exactly how and why the people that we affiliate with the Native Americans, whether it's the Sioux or any one of the numerous tribes, do have a closer connection. And let's look at the account of the Hopi of the Fifth World. The Hopi, one of the descended tribes or nations from the ancestral Puebloans. What I find intriguing, though, about the accounts of the Hopi is some of the Puebloans, or the Pueblo ruins that are still present in the southwest United States. And whether we're in southwest Colorado or anywhere else, you'll see that there's some very dramatic ruins there that give you the impression of settlements that were very well constructed and planned out. And oftentimes you'll have the remnants of infrastructure that we tend to associate with older civilizations. Could this have been some sort of reset compound of its own? A place where the people attempted to survive? The Hopi are perhaps most interesting in terms of their account of the reset because they do have an oral tradition that relates that we are currently in what they consider the Fourth World, or at least the Fourth Era to them. And yes, this is one of the accounts that actually inspired the concept of the Five Eras on this channel. And I think there's a lot of details that do reach us through the Hopi oral traditions. And it should be noted that one of the reasons why I personally hold such a high respect for Native American nations and tribes is because of the fact that they have retained this very close connection that they have. One, to their own personal history, the true account of what happened, but also their understanding of achieving a balance with the land, the resources provided by the land, the other creatures that dwelled upon the land. That's something that I think is always respectable. When you actually look into the artwork of the Hopi, though, you'll find some very interesting representations. Now, were these just a people who didn't have an understanding of their land? The oral traditions and what we see, it seems that they had a great understanding of what was really happening. And the fact that they do relate to us of what happened in the distant past, with worlds that fell out of balance, with peoples who indulged in evil practices. And this is what ultimately caused what they would consider a reset in what they term the previous worlds. Now, once again, I'm just giving a generalized summary of these oral traditions. I think the best way to really share these oral traditions would be to actually have a member of one of these nations or tribes relay them on a video. And if there's a demand for that, I may consider it. As it may be, I do have the means of actually having some individuals relay their oral traditions. Now, are there oral traditions that they will not share? Absolutely. And can we really be surprised that there are many things that they don't share with others? Not at all. Because in many of the mentalities, it's because of the fact that knowledge has to be earned. You simply can't bestow it on people. You simply can't share something and have it repeated. And we certainly see examples of that in our current society, in our current civilization. That we simply repeat an account that's given to us, we apply no critical thinking or thought to it, and suddenly it becomes the truth, and it becomes the incontrovertible truth. And yet when you look across the land and you consider these many different wondrous accounts that the Native American nations had, their oral traditions seem to reflect many dimensions that were once really present on the land. And indeed, I've always given a lot more veracity to what they've shared with the origin story, especially with how the land came to be. One area that's always intrigued me is the Mojave Desert, and especially the area around what we call Death Valley to this day. How exactly was the land scarred in the way that it was? What's the true account of what really happened? Was there some sort of comet or meteorite that actually hit the area and destroyed the land? And what about the ant people? Yes, the ant people who helped the Hopi. It's even stated that they saved them twice from destruction, taking them to the underground, in great underground cities. And once again, we have another account of a more advanced people with greater cities. And who were these ant people? There's many different theories. Some state that they were extraterrestrials. Others state that they're simply more advanced civilizations that live in the crust of the very earth itself, or whatever you want to think of it as. There's many conflicting views in who and what the ant people could have been. But the fact that there's this spiritual resonance that you see that still endures with these oral traditions today, and the simple fact that they're still remembered and recounted. We can see how the Hopi were dispersed across the current state of Arizona, and where their reservations were. The reservations, a definite sign that the Native Americans endured a reset that was imposed by another power. That was just simply the way that they endured it. And then, of course, the American education system, which is all part of the conflict assimilation indoctrination concept or process that seemed to be used on everyone across the land after the last reset. And yet, for whatever reason, the Native Americans, whether it's the Hopi, the Navajo, the Lakota, or any of the other tribes or nations, managed to retain their connections with their past. And they've also managed to retain a very deep connection with the land. And that's one of the main reasons why I believe that they have a more accurate account of what may have transpired in the past. Now, are there other details that we still may be searching out? Are there other dramatic examples of what could have happened? Absolutely. But again, you simply can't repeat something. You simply can't share something. Knowledge has to be struggled for in many ways, shapes, and forms. And it takes experience. For example, looking at this incredible area. The Anasazi Ruin in Mesa Verde, southwestern Colorado. A very impressive city that seems to have been built in the very rock itself. Many intriguing realities exist, though, about these particular sites in terms of how they're actually hidden within the land, and they even seem to be hidden from aerial observation. Quite an interesting consideration if we're to take the past chronology that we're given from the mainstream at face value. Many of these wondrous terrain features, though, that these cities were hidden in still exist to this day, and we have to reevaluate exactly what we see in terms of the Native Americans. These weren't just a hunter-gatherer culture that simply roved the land as nomads. These were people that were very much in touch with their society, their culture, and their land. And the fact that they built incredible cities like this within the land itself. And we have to also evaluate what it means that they seem to have been concealed from aerial observation, because that's one of the realities that's often faced. It's an observation that's called out with many of these older settlements that still endure to this day. How exactly did they build them, and what resources did they really have? And when we look at the ruins of these cities and amazed at how well they're holding out, we also consider how we might think of this area as being very underpopulated currently. But was that always the case? And indeed, what actual details occurred within this particular land, these four corners of these states: Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and then even going beyond the four states to the west to Nevada. It's very intriguing when we consider these accounts and this impressive land. We consider the fact that these wondrous cities were once built by these people, seemingly hidden by aerial observation. Was there some sort of threat that could have come from the air? It's one of the things that when you look at how a city could have defended itself, we oftentimes look at the cities in Europe, and we've talked about the Great Star Fort fortifications, at least that's what we're informed about them, and indeed they even came across the United States during the United States Civil War. But these fortifications were not very effective. We consider the Cliff Palace and how it was actually constructed in Mesa Verde, and yet we see signs of similar construction. We see an industrious people who were creative and managed to actually build a very geometrically impressive city and yet also conceal it within the very land itself. And whatever the adversary or threat that they were facing at that time, it was quite ingenious. And if you have the means and you're anywhere near Mesa Verde, Colorado, I certainly recommend visiting these sites because there's nothing like an on-site exploration. The very impressive and geometrically precise Pueblo Bonito, laid out in northern Mexico, or northern New Mexico, by the ancestral Puebloans, as they are called. Again, what's the true history behind these peoples, and how exactly do they relate to the current nations and tribes? Do their oral traditions actually indicate that these great civilizations existed, or do they have a different account of them? That's something I certainly encourage you all to research and come to your own conclusions on, because it's very difficult to determine. And also remember the fact that if you go to further latitudes in the south, you'll come across actual pyramids. Mexico is really not that far away from New Mexico, and it's really not that far away from the United States, where we'll be assured that there were no pyramids built by the civilizations at that time. But whether we're talking about the Aztec, the Mayan, or the Incan, we always have signs that there may have been much more that was occurring in the past. When we look at northern New Mexico, we see one of the most dramatic remains of an area called Shiprock. Shiprock with a very unique rock formation that, oddly enough, seems to have walls coming off from it, going in multiple directions. Of course, the mainstream tells us that this is merely the result of volcanic activity and a series of natural geological activity over the years, and yet the Navajo have quite the interesting origin story. And now let's go to St. Louis to look at the Mississippian culture. Yes, there were actual mounds in the city of St. Louis, although some people have tried to tell me that there were only mounds in Cahokia across the river in Illinois. But these mounds did actually exist in the city of St. Louis, and the mainstream and the official history of the city indicates that these mounds were removed. And these actual mounds that you could say resemble certain structures, we've been over it many times, were removed because they needed to make way for building the city of St. Louis. So once again, we have another account of a massive excavation project that had to be undertaken during a time when there was limited to virtually no heavy machinery, and yet once again working very, very hard and diligently and having plenty of time to pose for pictures. The people of St. Louis in the 1800s had the time to remove these mounds. Indeed, there was supposedly an ironclad, and yes, I'm going to use that term directly, in the United States Civil War, named the USS Mound City after this area of mounds. Unfortunately, somebody had the foresight to take pictures of these mounds before they were removed from St. Louis. Even an account saying that the mounds were removed to facilitate having the World's Fair. And now we're actually looking at the mound in Cahokia in Illinois, just to make it very clear for some people who try to claim that there were mounds that were only in Cahokia. Yes, this is the Great Mound in Cahokia. What was this really, though? Is this the remnant of something much more dramatic and a sign of something beyond natural terrain? Well, even the mainstream tells us that this is not just a hill, this is actually a mound, and that this was artificially constructed. But what's the truth of the reality behind this particular picture? What in fact is the truth behind these Mississippian cultures, as they called them? Now, these were ancient Native Americans, as they like to say, that lived in this particular area of the United States, centered around the Mississippi, although they seemed to spread out quite a bit, didn't they? And you might recall in the distant past of the channel, we did explore a site called Aztalan in Wisconsin. We'll take a look at that again because that is connected with these Mississippian cultures. And something else I'll ask you to consider is, do the oral traditions of the current Native Americans actually reflect the reality of these Mississippian cultures, or is this merely a mainstream interpretation from the current universities and scholars of the United States? And yes, I'm well aware that there are many Native Americans who have taken part in these studies, and I'm not saying or questioning their legitimacy. I'm merely saying that we need to apply critical thinking and ensure that what we're looking at is the actual account. Because what's intriguing to me about this Mississippian culture is just how advanced it's shown as being in a lot of this artwork. But how accurate is it? In other words, could it have been much more advanced? Could they have actually been the very cities that are still sitting there? Or is there some other explanation? Could it also be that what they're really referring to are the remnants of the civilization from the Third Era, before the reset to the Fourth Era? Or could it have simply been the surviving enclaves from the Fourth Era to our current era? Again, we're referring to the channel's 5 eras theory. But you can see how it ties wonderfully into the other accounts, oral traditions, that came from any number of Native American nations or tribes. Indeed, we look at how the Spanish explored the United States, according to the mainstream account, and what they may have come across. And oftentimes what we're told is that the early explorers gave us the details of these Mississippian cultured peoples, or whatever you want to call them, because they seem to have different names. Oddly enough, whatever group of people we're talking about, they left wondrous artwork and many different examples. We're also informed by those original European explorers, again, according to the mainstream, that these cultures were actually into human sacrifice, much like the Aztecs. And the reason were stated is that because they believed they were living in the final era, and the only thing that was going to keep the last sun from dying out was by engaging in human sacrifice. Although, how much truth is there to this account? And remember who this account came from, because we might want to recall that according to the mainstream history, the Spanish did impose this little economic system called encomienda. Encomienda, which was not exactly kind to the survival of many of the individuals from the civilizations that once flourished in these lands. Now, is this exactly what happened? Well, it's what the mainstream tells us. Or are there more details behind it? Is there something else occurring that we may not be aware of? Is there a reason that there is such an effort made to convince us that this Mississippian culture existed the way that it did? Is it simply trying to direct our focus somewhere else? There's no doubt that there's many mounds across the land, and no doubt that they seem to reflect a great understanding of engineering and geometric precision, and they certainly took a lot of work to achieve. And of course, we're not going to call them pyramids because they're not pyramids, they are mounds. But yet, whenever you look at the examples of the artwork and you understand exactly what it really reflects, you have to ask, is this something that this actual people did? Or were these merely remnants and artifacts that were found later that were attributed to a different group of people? How could anybody or everybody get it exactly right, is all I'm asking. Because it's amazing to me how confident we are and how oftentimes we like to hand wave, categorize, and label many groups of people. And we still do that to this day. And it certainly doesn't have to be an ancient people or civilization that we're not aware of. But yet we seem to have this perception that this great culture, this great civilization was capable of achieving these mounds, and they had a great understanding of the land. And yet they always want to tell us that they seem to have a darker side, while at the same time ignoring our own darker side. Going back to the Aztalan site in Wisconsin, near Lake Mills in Wisconsin, just south of I-94 between Madison and Milwaukee, I'm reminded of those sites that I saw there. And over a year ago, I walked them and actually explored them. And if you have any sort of site with mounds like this anywhere close to where you may be located in the land, I strongly suggest walking it and looking at it on site. The reason I started with Google Earth, and this was actually one of the original explorations that turned me away from using Google Earth, because there were a lot of details that you just don't see. But when you actually get on the ground, you'll see what a mound looks like and what a pyramid actually looks like. And remember that we define certain things as mounds, especially anything in the United States, and the only pyramids in North America are to be found in what is today Mexico. The 1800s, a century with lots of development and technological innovations, along with conflict and vast social changes. We have so many clues from this particular century. Today we're going to explore the strange events of the 1800s.
I'm no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
So the first event we'll look at is the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815. At least that's what the official history tells us. The Napoleonic Wars are interesting because we start the century off with a vast series of conflicts, primarily centered in Europe, although it should be noted that these conflicts occurred across the land and the sea. Indeed, if you ever watched Master and Commander, that ship battle was set around South America. We see many different depictions, though, of Napoleon, and in the past, the channel explored the concept of Napoleon being some sort of reset commander who decided to go against the grain and try to establish himself as a leading authority figure. There are many oddities about this conflict, though, including the ability to defy logistical limitations. Now, what's interesting about the Napoleonic Wars is they occurred after the initial start of what we're told is the Industrial Revolution. It was also the first attempt at nations to engage in mass mobilization or conscripting very large armies. And these armies they were somehow able to sustain because we're told that the Industrial Revolution had improved agricultural capacity. Napoleon was a bit of a maverick character, and the official history says that, and I suspect that what the true account is, if Napoleon did exist, is that he's a bit of a maverick character as well. Yet in the recent movie that we saw, Napoleon looked anything but interested in whatever he was doing, and of course that's just the creative choices of the movie, which I found rather interesting. And we certainly know that Joaquin Phoenix is a great actor, but when you contrast that with some of the images that we have in Napoleon, we certainly see a vast difference. We're led to believe by the official historical account that Napoleon was a very charismatic figure, and he was very engaging, and he was also a military genius. And yet in the film, we find out that the love of his life, Josephina, was his main concern, although it should be noted that when she was seducing him, he looked like he couldn't be even more disinterested. But again, creative choices in the movie. Yet in many of these other images that we see of him, he is this very inspiring commander, and he managed to unify France during a time of vast social change and revolution. Of course, it led to a very bloody conflict, and for whatever reason, the most interesting thing about the Napoleonic Wars is once the conflict ended, Napoleon was not imprisoned, he was not executed for starting wars that killed millions of people. He was simply sent away initially to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean, where he was allowed to live in comfort. He escaped from the island and started another war, and was defeated yet again. And so he was exiled, this time to St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic, the southern Atlantic, in one of the most remote locations on Earth. Yet, of course, they still gave him a nice mansion to live out his days in. Now imagine if the guy from World War II with the mustache had ended up like that. Imagine if they'd given him some nice retirement villa after World War II in some South American nation. I wonder how well that would have been received. Many questions, though, about the Napoleonic conflict, and many conflicting accounts, and I'm not here to lampoon the movie. I've done that in other explorations. I just find the creative decisions interesting, and we know that everyone who was involved with the film was very creatively inspired, and there were great performers. It should be noted that we do have some images of soldiers dressing up in uniforms from that particular time frame, although what the authenticity of these actual photos are is left to the imagination. I'd imagine a uniform like that would get a little warm, especially in the summer days going across Europe, but you never know. I mean, at least you look really cool and you've got many different aspects to your uniform. So that's the Napoleonic Wars. Let's go to the year without a summer, 1816. The year without a summer, the eruption of Mount Tambora in what is now Indonesia, which caused the entire area and sky of the land to be blanketed with ash, and as a result it reduced the sunlight reaching the land and caused a vast drop in temperatures, and as the title implies, it was the year without the summer. Is that really what transpired, though? And here we have the comparison of different volcanoes, and Mount Tambora is one of the biggest in recorded human history in terms of cubic miles of ejecta. Nice word there, ejecta. And what we're told is that this eruption caused an entire layer of volcanic ash to stop the sun from penetrating, and it greatly disrupted the seasons. Oddly enough, though, when you try to corroborate this with local accounts and news and history at the time, it's a little bit of a conflicting account because it seems to affect some areas more than others, and certainly we can make that conclusion that that's always the case when we have an event such as this. There's different aspects of artwork, and it should even be noted that this year without a summer even influenced Mary Shelley to tell her little story about Frankenstein, which endures to this day. What really transpired, though, with this year without a summer? Is this exactly what happened and why? Or was this because of other causes and other events? Is this because this eruption was actually something else that happened that changed the nature of the landscape? Indeed, one of the recurring challenges that we have, according to the official history in the 1800s, is the vast changes in weather. Although what's interesting is that we're told that there was a little bit of a cold period that supposedly ended in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and yet you'll find later that we have a recurrence of cold periods throughout the entire century, from 1800 to 1899. We have many paintings that show us that there were great hardships as a result of this year without a summer. We're told that there were many lives lost because of famines due to the crop losses. We're also told that there were other complications. And yet, oddly enough, as I said earlier, when you try to actually compare and contrast many of these accounts that were contemporaneous from this time frame, they're very conflicting. It seems as though this disaster was felt in some areas more than others, and as I've said, there's nothing odd about that. That's entirely possible. But where the oddities come into play is some of the observations that you have of what was really occurring at that time. Changes of observations in the sky, changes of actual crop yields, and the true effect of this year without a summer. One thing that's interesting is you would think that this would have a great crippling effect on the nascent United States as a nation, as the United States had just come out of the War of 1812 and was still a relatively new nation. And yet, it does not appear to have been negatively affected by this year without a summer. What do you think this event was, and what was really going on, and why do we have so many conflicting accounts? And now we go to the New Madrid earthquake in 1811, the greatest earthquake recorded in North America, and oddly enough, near Missouri, New Madrid, Missouri specifically, and yet we're told that very few people died. A very horrific earthquake that is even reputed to have caused the mighty Mississippi to flow backwards. Now again, this is another questionable event. What exactly was going on? Was this just a random earthquake? And of course, as you can see, we have all of the plaques that tell us exactly what happened, and we shouldn't question the plaques because nobody would actually put the money to put up things that aren't true or didn't really happen. And there's no doubt that something happened, and we're told that it was a magnitude 7.2 earthquake in New Madrid, Missouri, and the effects were felt everywhere. Yet, oddly enough, no loss of life, but vast damage of many structures. And don't you find that interesting? So, if there weren't a lot of people living there, then what structures were actually damaged? Well, again, just don't think about it too much. We have a historical account, and we know that it was a very terrible earthquake. And even though we have plenty of first-hand accounts of the Mississippi flowing backwards and many other odd observations from the time frame, what do you think the New Madrid earthquake actually represented and what was going on? The New Madrid fault line, which we're told is still active, although it hasn't really been active since this earthquake in 1811. And certainly if there were any tremors or earthquakes that have occurred, we'd hear about it. The revolutions of 1848. The revolutions of 1848 revolved around social change, ostensibly centered in Europe, although it seems as though it occurred across the land. And what we're told is that the people had grown tired of being under the rule of monarchs and other difficult situations and the authoritarian rules that they employed in Europe at that time. And therefore, many of the people in the working classes decided to rise up and rebel against their monarch governments and many of the other authoritarian regimes that were going on at the time. Now, the official history tells us that this period of uprising was very bloody, and officially what had happened was that the revolutions were put down by the monarch governments at the time. Although on a longer timeline, what ended up happening was certain individuals such as Otto von Bismarck and what would become the nation of Germany, they did give concessions to the desire of the citizenry to actually have more rights. At least that's what we're told. And it's a very odd account. What was really going on? Was this really a grassroots social revolution that occurred in 1848? Or was this something else? Because it's interesting to note just how many years in the 1800s were actually filled with conflict. External conflict, internal conflict. And yet, oddly enough, none of these nations ever seem to have any issue with mobilizing their vast military resources or even logistically sustaining them, whether they were on expeditionary campaigns across far seas or whether they were fighting their own citizens in an internal conflict or a quote-unquote civil war, which we've talked about quite extensively on the channel. But what did these social revolutions really point to? And did these leaders really actually represent the desires of the people, or were they simply giving the people what their desires were? The revolutions were put down, but since they were called revolutions over a long enough timeline, they were considered successful. So even in the historicity of these social revolutions of 1848, we have a conflicting account. The governments prevailed and put down the armed insurrection, as it were, but the desires and the aims of the people to actually achieve a greater set of freedoms, or let's be honest, it was actually liberties that they were looking for, because when you operate in a society, you only have liberty, you don't actually have freedom. And they had achieved some of the liberties that they were looking for. Although this didn't stop many people from emigrating to the United States from many of these nations where they felt oppression, and there were other issues that were going on. We can refer to many isolated instances of people that simply didn't have enough to sustain themselves, such as the potato famine in Ireland. And there's many other examples. The artwork from this period reflects a very brutal conflict, and we see a lot of siege battles, and we see many great assaults that gives us the impression that this was a much more brutal conflict. It's also intriguing to note some of the wondrous architecture that we have that was already available in the 1800s. It's yet another one of these major events from the 1800s that causes us to question what was really going on. The 1800s population bomb, namely in the United States. We look at how fast the population growth occurred in the United States, and we have a separate exploration on that. But across the entire lands, we're told the population didn't really grow that much. And yet, once again, you have conflicting accounts. And as we ascertain, the population of the United States itself grew over 1,000% from 1800 to 1900. And then we have certain United States cities where the population grew 200,000% in a 100-year period, such as Seattle from 1860 to 1960. So again, what was really going on? We have many accounts, especially in the United States, of vast population growth. It just feels like you're on a ride and they're constantly revising things. The orphan trains, 1850, well, did they ever really stop? That's certainly debatable. The odd thing about the orphan trains, which we've explored extensively on the channel, is it seems to be a redistribution of population, or as we speculated when we did the initial explorations, it seemed to be a diaspora of children, moving them out and spreading them out from where their original homeland actually was. Now, we're told that there were very benevolent and altruistic reasons for doing this. We had children who were stuck in the cities, although it just really seemed to apply to New York City and not all the cities on the United States eastern seaboard. There were also accounts of the orphan trains occurring in other nations across the land. And while the initial impression is that this only applied to one particular social group or nationality of children, it actually applied to all groups of children, if you do a little bit more looking and investigating in terms of what actually happened. But we have children that were spread out all across the land in many different locations, and the reason I put the question mark in terms of not knowing when this ended is who's to say that this really ended, as we still have orphans from current conflicts who get spread out to different lands. Now, it may be true that this is for an altruistic purpose, and we're legitimately trying to help these children. You can find no shortage of public broadcasting specials where they have veterans of the orphan trains who are interviewed, and they talk about how wonderful their experience was and the family that adopted them treated them very well. And I have no doubt that that's the case, but it's just odd that we have this very positive image of children that were, in many cases, taken from their families, their rightful families, as there's many cases of the one parent that was still alive in the 1800s, and the children were taken away from them and then sent around to other areas in the country. Was there something much more insidious going on? And the orphan trains is another one of those great examples from the 1800s that there seemed to be a lot more going on than what the official history tells us. One of the real purposes of this exploration, though, is I'm looking to detail some of the evidence that we have in the mainstream account that enables us to construct our theories in terms of what really happened. Now, at the end of this exploration, I'm going to go back and I'm going to say exactly what the mainstream tells us in terms of doing this, because only two types of people are allowed to really ascertain what's actually going on in the land, and those people are scientists and historians. They're the only ones who can tell you if you're in a conspiracy, and you may get spun around and thrown around and you're not really sure what's going on. Victoria to the USA, 1800 to 1900. In the 1800s, we had what was called the Victorian era in the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, as it were at the time, and that was the time when they said that the sun didn't set on the British Empire. And indeed, the British Army was second to none in the world, at least according to the official history, and they had a lot of ability to project military capacity across the land. Although the situation in Great Britain after the Industrial Revolution is conflicted. We have numerous accounts of child labor and very difficult labor conditions, and that was part of what led to some of the social revolutions that we talked about in 1848. We also have a very conflicted account of society. We have a great group of haves and have-nots, and this actually reached its culmination point in some of the writings of H.G. Wells when he posited that the class division would lead to separate evolutionary paths on humanity. Ah, yes, evolution. That's always a good one to consider, where they ended up in his novel The Time Machine, the workers becoming the Morlocks, or creatures that lived underground for hundreds of thousands of years, and the Eloi, or the descendants of the people that lived the Victorian lifestyle of being the higher class. Of course, people say that H.G. Wells didn't know that the middle class would develop. Queen Victoria is an interesting character, as most individuals of monarchy are, and we're told that she actually reached her Diamond Jubilee, one of the few monarchs to do so. We also have many other accounts of what life was actually like during that time frame, and while you have the great Victorian parties and many well-dressed people, you also have these accounts of very unfortunate labor conditions and slums that are all over the place. Yet, oddly enough, during the same time frame, you also have accounts of housing being constructed across Great Britain and in Scotland, where many of these tenements managed to endure to this day. The challenge was, though, in the 1960s when they began new urban development programs in places such as Scotland, they didn't exactly know what they're doing, at least that's what the official history says, and so they ended up displacing many people and putting them into large tower residences that didn't exactly work out so well. There's a little film from the late 90s called Ratcatcher which depicts this quite well, and naturally it stars Tommy Flanagan. And then the Victorian time frame and the British were supplanted by the United States, the nascent nation of the United States, which became a world power, and the event which official history tells us that prompted that was the Spanish-American War, and we just looked at the wreckage of the USS Maine, which was sunk in Cuba. by supposedly the Spanish, because Cuba was a Spanish possession at that time. And the United States got drawn into the conflict, or rather incited the conflict, depending on your view of history. And the United States engaged in what they called a splendid little war against Spain. And as a result, Cuba was liberated from Spain and became its own nation. And the United States acquired numerous colonial possessions, even though the United States was not supposed to be a nation that was interested in acquiring colonial possessions, namely the Philippines, which would go on to play a very significant role during World War II. It's very odd, though, to consider how the United States in just 100 short years had gone from being a nascent backwater nation to becoming a world power. And many historians agree that the Spanish-American War was when the United States had become a world power. Suddenly, it had managed to master the aspects of the expeditionary military approach, it built a navy overnight, and it also began to employ a national army. To what we have today, where the United States is the only military that actually divides up all the known lands into geographical areas of responsibility called combatant commands. And it seems that without a doubt that this transition of power, or at least the overt exercising of military power, was complete at the end of World War II, where the United States would be the primary practitioner of military campaigns across the land. Many of the battles from the Spanish-American War are very interesting to consider, whether you're looking at the battles that occurred in Cuba or in the Philippines. It's an odd comparison of naval actions with land actions, and whether you're looking at the exploits of Admiral Dewey or Teddy Roosevelt himself, you have this odd theme with the United States military where it seems that adventurers are always very successful. And yet you compare and contrast that with some of the earlier failed American military adventures, especially in the War of 1812. And here we have Teddy Roosevelt himself giving a very rousing speech to one of the oddities that occurred after the Spanish-American War, the Great White Fleet. The Great White Fleet was supposed to be a showcase of the new American military power, at least in the Navy. And we're told that Teddy Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and whose face adorns Mount Rushmore to this day, was a proponent of utilizing naval power. And indeed, naval power was considered one of the most threatening aspects to world peace, as there was the Washington Naval Treaty. Again, this is all the official history. Although isn't it odd that many of these treaties merely serve to encourage, or at least we're told encourage, more innovative approaches to military problems. Perhaps the most interesting aspect, though, in the change of power from the United Kingdom or Great Britain to the United States is just how seamlessly it seemed to happen. And you can really look closely at the development from the Spanish-American War in 1898 to the end of World War II in 1945, and really look at the official strength of the Navy and the military, and then also in what geographical areas both the nations were applied in. It went from the sun never sets on the British Empire to the sun never sets on the presence of the United States military. And whether it's a base or the vast naval presence of the United States military, that all seemed to have its incipience in the use of the Great White Fleet. And here you can see these were the ports of call, and isn't it odd that there weren't many ports of call in Europe at that time? Because you would think they would want to show off the Great White Fleet to nations such as the United Kingdom and Germany. And of course, we have no shortage of our great plaques that tell us exactly what happened, and the interesting historiosity of the Great White Fleet, and where it was applied and where it wasn't applied. There's no shortage, though, of documentation and photographs and articles and plaques written about the Great White Fleet. It's quite intriguing. It's intriguing to think that the Great White Fleet occurred right after the World's Fairs. And now we look at technology. The technological developments of the 1800s are very intriguing. From photographs to telephone to the car, electric telegraph, the vast railway networks, especially in the United States, that the United States managed to apply more rail networks than any other nation, and x-rays, underground railroads, sewing machines, rubber tires, and of course, the public flushing toilet. So you see right there all these technological innovations in the 1800s which brought about modern life. Now, of course, we have some other looks at history that suggest that perhaps there were more technological innovations. Now, there's no official documentation of a television from the 1800s, but it should be noted that there are a lot of rumors of it. State capitals, 1800 to 1899. And we've done many explorations of state capitals, and I always find it interesting that nearly half the states in the United States still have their original state capitals from the 1800s. And they're very gorgeous and impressive buildings, and they're standing quite well to this day. And there seems to be no issue with the maintenance of these buildings, although we'll have conflicting accounts in terms of how well constructed they were. Apparently there was no issue with building a beautiful state capitol in Denver, Colorado in the mountains in the 1800s, and it still stands to this day. We've looked at the Capitol in Connecticut, another one of the most beautiful ones, and in my humble opinion it compares very closely with what we consider as building number one in our explorations here on this channel. But when you look across at all these different state capitals and you see the similar designs, it's intriguing to think that all these state capitals were built at the same time as many of the county courthouses across the land, with very intricate construction and great details, such as the state capitol here in Springfield, Illinois. And was Springfield the home of the Simpsons? I don't know. They made several allusions to it. We'll have an upcoming exploration on that one. There's state capitals everywhere, though, that give you the impression of great portal windows, wondrous domes, and very interesting construction material. When you go to assess it, you'll be told it's a combination of sandstone, limestone, and of course, I couldn't resist throwing in building number one, the Iowa State Capitol. Even its construction material is quite intriguing, and when you view it on the inside, you definitely get the feeling that you're not in any sort of state capitol, but you're in a palace. And wherever you look at these state capitals, you'll see the similar construction stylings, the pediment, the dome, the great columns, the pillars that are built in the wall, and then of course they're always on hills. And wherever you are in the land, you'll find that there's never any shortage of the construction capabilities. There are certain aspects that match, and yet there are many nuances that show off in many of these wondrous state capitals. And keep in mind, we're looking at only the state capitals that were specifically constructed in the 1800s. We have a couple beauties that were supposedly constructed in the 1700s, and then we have quite a few in the early 1900s. And yet they all seem to be constructed from the same time frame when you compare some of them. And it's very odd that the ability to lay out these wondrous state capitals seemed to end for good around the 1930s, although really you could say it was around the 1920s. New York State Capitol is always very interesting, as you would expect to see a traditional dome, and we don't have that. We have what looks to be a wonderful mansion, or maybe another home for the Vanderbilts. I'm just saying it looks that way, I'm not suggesting that. And yet wherever you are in the land, you can always find that these state capitals from the 1800s are going to endure for all time, and they give great inspiration in terms of their construction capabilities, whether they have a dome on top or not, or a pediment, or they're slightly different styles. There are different styles when it comes to the 1800s, and yet so many things that seem to be the same. It's a complex situation of similar architecture, and yet we're supposed to believe that all this occurred in the 1800s, along with all the great courthouses. And let's not forget the wondrous state capitol in Austin, Texas, something that quite frankly exceeds the capital of the United States, not just in terms of its space, but its location, its overall beauty. And wherever you look, whether you're in the smaller states of Vermont or New Hampshire, you'll see that the same stylings of the state capitol are not lost. And even in Wyoming, when they just had cowboys and settlers and prospectors, they were still able to design and erect a very impressive state capitol. And I'm sure there's no shortage of talented architects to be found. The World's Fairs from 1851 through 1900. The World's Fairs are one of the interesting elements of exploration that we do when it comes to this alternative research, because these represent the fact that something strange was going on in the 1800s. Yes, the telescope from the Chicago World's Fair, which to this day you can still go and see in an observatory off Lake Geneva in Wisconsin, where it ended up. We have many wonderful showcasings of buildings from these World's Fairs and odd enough exhibitions of great technology, because even though this was nascent technology, it seems as though the people managed to adapt very quickly. The beautiful Crystal Palace, the mobile Crystal Palace from the original World's Fair. Yes, quite intriguing that they managed to produce all this glass in a record amount of time, and then they managed to move it because building it wasn't good enough. Gotta give Great Britain credit though. All their wondrous old world infrastructure, it's mobile. But unfortunately, the Crystal Palace is no longer with us, as it caught fire in the 1930s, and we'll be doing an exploration where we're going to look a lot more closely at this particular Crystal Palace. How exactly does a structure such as this catch on fire? Well, just don't ask, okay? We just know it happens. And here you can see the unfortunate devastated remnants of the Crystal Palace, although it looks like the tower came off pretty nicely. I wonder why they tore down the tower. Well, because the main structure was gone. The gold rushes of 1849, 1896, gold rushes to California, gold rushes to Alaska, the Klondike, the Yukon, all the unique areas that seem to draw vast amounts of people. I wonder why we don't have gold rushes to this day. Oh, that's right. We don't need to have gold rushes. We have cryptocurrency rushes, and you can just do those from the comfort of your own computer. You don't need to get on a really uncomfortable boat and go to some unfortunate area that has no development whatsoever and no logistical capacity and decide to go prospecting for gold. And indeed, the official history tells us that no one came up successful when they were looking for gold. But we do have these interesting photos that show this vast arrival of ships in ports such as San Francisco. Now, let's just think about this. Is this exactly what's really happening? Are we really looking at all these prospectors who filled up San Francisco Bay in a very short amount of time? Or was something else being depicted here? A vast arrival of many people from some other area for another reason. And Gold Rush just happened to be a nice little way to explain it. Because even if you had a gold rush, don't you think people would be thinking about the fact that, I'm going to go to an area that is unsettled, uncivilized from my perspective, and look for gold? I mean, granted, Al Bundy did it in the 1980s, and it wasn't too successful, and it turned out that he was merely prospecting for fool's gold. Now let's look at blizzards and freezes of the 1800s, and we talked about earlier how the climate, the environment seemed to change a lot through the 1800s. Officially, we're told that things improved and warmed up through the 1800s, but then we have conflicting accounts of vast blizzards and great freezes, and it wasn't just the year without the summer in 1816. We even have one as late as 1899 where we have vast amounts of snow and very unseasonable cold temperatures that buried many of the cities in the Northeast and even brought strife to the cities in the southern United States, all the way down to Florida, where they were certainly not used to snowfall, and indeed the first image we looked at was snowfall in Florida. Many feet of snow fell, and it wasn't confined to the mountain resorts of Nevada or Lake Tahoe to this day, but they were all over the place. And why is it we have these recurring themes of vast amounts of snowfall? Did this reflect something else? Now, I know I haven't included the Carrington event in this particular series of explorations, and by all means did I not say that this exploration was comprehensive of all the strange events of the 1800s. Let's be honest, there were thousands. But we'll be looking at the Carrington event in a separate exploration because it is quite interesting, and we're told officially it didn't have many historical impacts, and yet other indications show that it did. Back to the weather, though, we can see how the weather affected, at least we're told, the United States especially. And yet again, despite all these great challenges, the loss of many oranges in Florida because of the weather issues, somehow the nation seemed to survive and continue to progress. And indeed, this was at the time when the United States became a world power, because this last blizzard in 1899 certainly didn't stop any of the great advances that the nation was making, and it did not impede its ability to take its stage with the world, especially when it came to World War I, where the introduction of American troops towards the end, we're told, was decisive to bringing about the Allies' final victory. So you have it, many great conflicting events from the 1800s, many strange events that give cause to question exactly what was going on and why. Many people have looked at the 1800s before, and it's a very odd time frame. And indeed, if a time frame that is so recent, at least in the grand scheme of the overall passage of time, has so many questions about it, then we really have to consider, where else do we have questions? What was real and what wasn't real? What happened and what didn't happen? Now, of course, if we consult the mainstream, they have answers for this, and they're going to tell us that we should not be thinking independently about this. And how exactly would the mainstream respond to these separate investigations, these explorations? Well, I think we should consider that to close this particular exploration. How does the mainstream respond to what we do with our alternative exploration? Well, this article might provide some insight. 1800s technology conspiracies behind the era of invention. And here we have the image of the individual in the 1800s looking at a television. Very fascinating. But we're told that it's known as the Age of Progress, the 1800s, the Second Industrial Revolution. I'm surprised we don't have 8 industrial revolutions, to be honest with you. However, a growing trend of conspiracy theories surrounding these inventions prompts intriguing discussions. So they do admit that this is intriguing and compelling. And they talk about the invention of the light bulb, and then they talk about the debate between Hiram Maxim and Thomas Edison. But then they say that Maxim himself, who said he invented the light bulb, was a controversial figure, because Thomas Edison is most certainly not a controversial figure. And by the way, remember, he did invent a version of Portland cement that was very, very useful in constructing certain stadiums, and we explored that in the past. Tesla's wireless electricity suppressed technology. And of course, they detail the efforts of Nikola Tesla to provide wireless technology, but then they say that there were many great obstacles to this wireless technology. Of course, there were no practical obstacles to all the other developments in the 1800s, such as the telegraph or the rapid construction of railroads, where none had existed. And when you can move 11,000 miles of track in 36 hours and change the gauge on it, why would there be any practical obstacles? Certainly not. The telephone patent race, and then finally our conclusion, decoding the conspiracy. While these 19th century technology conspiracy theories are captivating, they often reflect our own insecurities about technological control and credit more than they reveal about historical fact. Ah, yes, it's your own insecurities when you question things. That's why. The development of technology is rarely a linear path traced to a single individual. Rather, it's a collective endeavor. Oh, except when it comes to Edison, then it's a single individual, but I digress. By scrutinizing these conspiracies, we can better understand the complex social dynamics that shape technological progress. Yet it's crucial to separate sensational speculation, and you might notice that speculation and well-documented are two of the buzz terms we hear a lot, from nuanced historical understanding to truly appreciate the fascinating history of 1800s technological innovations. So in other words, things are only impossible until they're not, just like Captain Picard said. Well, let's take a look, because we have history and science and the two tend to run together. One of the responses that I received in a reply on the 1980s exploration is one of the elements that showed how far we've come in technological progress since 1980 when Carl Sagan did Cosmos was the detection of exoplanets. Carl Sagan had teased it in Cosmos in the 1980s, and I just thought we would look at how science tells us they actually detect exoplanets. Because are we actually able to see planets in other solar systems that are 25 trillion miles away? And by the way, that's the nearest solar system. And again, that's what science tells us. And what are the techniques that they use? Well, they have the wobbling star that hints at an exoplanet presence. The first planets found orbiting sun-like stars are detected by radial velocity technique. A single star devoid of a planetary system will have its center of gravity located at the center of the star. However, when a planet orbits a star, the center of gravity of the star-planet system becomes offset from the center of the star, causing the star to wobble. That's right. If you see a wobbly star, then it may have planets around it. Now, of course, we don't actually see these planets directly, but we can see a little bit of a wobble in a star. That's 25 trillion miles, and that's the nearest one, or many, many more, because 25 trillion miles is about 4.3 light years. Again, going off what the science tells us. There must be more techniques to detect exoplanets. Astrometry is the method that detects the motion of a star by making precise measurements of its position in the sky. Again, 25 trillion miles or more. This technique can be used to identify planets around a star by measuring tiny changes in the star's position as it wobbles around the center of mass of the planetary system. So again, we don't actually see the planets. We see how the star or the light is affected. And from that, scientists are able to ascertain that there are planets around the star. Because there's no other subspace anomalies out there or random other reasons for why there might be variances in the starlight or these wobbly effects that we have. Look, this is science. They are telling us the truth, and it's very clear that this is not speculation when they show us these images of these planets. Even though they don't actually see the planets, they see the changes in the light from the stars, what we're told. And it should be noted that this is the difference between rampant speculation, which is what we're doing when we actually question what we're told, as opposed to good science and good history. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Now once more I must ride with my knights to defend what was and the dream of what could be.
Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we're going to be examining the strangest events, unquestioned history. We have numerous historical events that have many anomalies in them. We're going to be looking at some select events today in this exploration, and we're going to see exactly what odd things have occurred in these historical events. And yet at the same time, these events are unquestioned, they are well documented, and they have brought us to the present. Let's begin our exploration. We begin by examining the Know Nothing movement, or the American Party, also known as the Native American Party, 1844 to 1860. This was a nativist party. Now, American politics have always been very intriguing and yet at the same time very simplistic, as there's always primarily been two parties, from the very incipience of the nation. This particular nativist party, though, was founded, yes, they even use that terminology for a political party, in 1844 to promote the rights of what they called Native Americans. Not what Native Americans are referred to today, but Native Americans in the mid-19th century, who were Protestant Americans. They were concerned about the sudden influx of immigrants from Ireland and Germany, primarily Catholic, because in their minds, the Catholic Church was a separate authority that was not under the secular authority that was legitimate American authority. So they founded this political party in 1844 to appeal to the good nature of Native Americans to oppose all this immigration. Now, why was this sudden immigration coming from Ireland and Germany? We're told that there was a potato famine in Ireland, and we're told there was a lot of social injustice in Germany. The revolutions of 1848, which the channel previously explored, in the Reset War of 1848. So what was really going on? Well, it seems as though this political party was a very foundational movement to propagate the rights of people who viewed themselves as Native Americans, or nativists. And indeed, our good friends over at the Smithsonian Magazine are quick to point out that Native sentiments or nativist sentiments are very incorrect, and that it is very foolhardy to embrace any sort of anti-immigration platform. What's unique about the Know Nothing Party, though, is just how briefly it existed. We have accounts of immigrants being attacked who worked on the Erie Canal, and this was back in the 1820s in New York, and yet at the same time it didn't seem to hinder the construction of the Erie Canal. We're also well aware of the fact that Irish and Germans make up the vast majority of many of the great cities that we've explored, and that they're responsible for building the cities. I mean, if I had a cent for every time someone told me about how Germans took part in the construction of Cincinnati. But isn't it interesting how we supposedly had this political party from 1844 to 1860, who's even reputed to have engaged in many violent acts against members of these immigrants in many of the cities that we've explored, and we did recount that in certain situations, such as in Louisville. But how exactly did a bunch of Germans end up in Cincinnati if there was this political party that was opposed to them, and yet they seemed to be able to continue to flourish and build the wonderful city that we saw? KN ticket, isn't that very interesting? Now, of course, we can see the parallels with at least what is presented to us of politics in America today, about how the whole concept of nativism and resisting immigration is totally incorrect and nobody should embrace it. It's very fascinating, though, that the exact same political principle that was in existence before the Civil War is still one of the primary political principles that's in existence now. And the other interesting thing is the Know Nothing Party's antipathy towards the Pope. It should be noted that during that time, the official history tells us that the Kingdom of Italy was snagging land from the Papal States until the Pope was pretty much confined to the Vatican. We checked that out in the Vatican exploration. But what was really the aim of this political party? It's hard to say in full terms what they were trying to do, because where the real historical anomalies come from is the fact that this political party was very short-lived. It was a really odd time in American political history, because while so many of us are more familiar with the two-party system, or the bipartisan system, which is what we all know we'll live and die by, because, if you had a third major political party in the United States, people might be a little confused. Things are either right or they're wrong. You either agree with them or you disagree with them, and you shouldn't think anywhere beyond those lines. And we're also told that this nativist party, the Know Nothing Party, or the American Party, or the Native American Party, or whatever name you want to call it, was really one of the foundational events that caused America to go to its bipartisan system. Indeed, the end of the Know Nothing Party came about from the United States Civil War, and we're told that they couldn't really agree upon their platform with slavery, because when most of them joined the Republican Party, at least back during this time frame, was opposed to slavery. In fact, they even called many Republicans who opposed slavery radical Republicans, and so on and so forth. And so, just like that, that was the end of the Know Nothing Party. They had no platform, and they simply evaporated. The U.S. Civil War comes along, and then the next thing you know, you have Irish brigades fighting each other on opposite battles in North and South. So what are your thoughts on the Know Nothing Party? What do you think it really represented? What was it all really about? And why did it just simply vanish with nobody really protesting? We now consider the story of James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense in the United States. James Forrestal came from a very strong Irish Catholic family, indeed the very people that the Know Nothing Party apparently opposed. He grew up and he had a strict sense of discipline and eventually made a name for himself as a financier on Wall Street. Finally, he rose to the position of Secretary of the Navy during World War II under the Roosevelt administration, and then eventually became the first nation Secretary of Defense. This is the house he lived in, a nice little old world house in Washington, D.C., the Prospect House, built in 1788. Some very nice brickwork on it. But going back to the story of James Forrestal, when he was initially appointed as Secretary of the Navy during World War II, he oversaw one of the largest and most effective shipbuilding programs in the history of the known lands. We'll look at shipbuilding figures when we look at the sudden expansion of the United States Navy as another one of our historical anomalies. Forrestal was a proponent of the Carrier Battle Group, now called the Carrier Strike Group, the Navy being centered around large aircraft carriers with many supporting ships, and being able to project expeditionary power across the lands. However, Forrestal was not a full supporter of the New Deal, at least it was stated he did not champion it. Additionally, he came to odds with his president, President Harry S. Truman, in terms of the management of the armed forces. Indeed, Forrestal opposed the creation of a Department of Defense and preferred the old War Department. Interestingly enough, when you consider the United States military's record since it's been under the Department of Defense. Regardless, Forrestal was a very effective Secretary of Defense, being able to work with many different people, and he tried to oppose the crippling of the United States military, or at least the vast reduction that occurred at the end of World War II. Forrestal stated that the United States faced a grave threat from the Soviet Union, and that the threat of expansion from the communist powers needed to be checked. The other intriguing aspect is when we consider the fact that not only was the United States military very rapidly reduced after World War II, there are even accounts of equipment simply being tossed overboard from ships, much in the same way as we remember steam locomotive engines being crashed into each other at the start of the 20th century, and we even have video footage of that. Well, there's a lot of footage that indicate that a lot of military surplus equipment was lost simply because the government didn't make money to store it. Forrestal also ran afoul of Drew Pearson. Drew Pearson was a journalist for one of our favorite periodicals, the Washington Post. Drew Pearson was critical of Forrestal as he felt that Forrestal did not adequately support the partition of Palestine plan, which had ended World War II. Forrestal argued that if the partition of Palestine was carried out, that it would anger many of the Arab states which the United States was reliant on for oil. However, Pearson criticized Forrestal, saying that this was not the right viewpoint to have, and as a result of which Forrestal lost a lot of credibility with President Truman. And indeed, he also paid for it in other ways. Pearson would run afoul of problems of his own, though, when he'd come across Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin as they engaged in a fist fight in 1950. It stated that Pearson lost because McCarthy caught him off guard. Very interesting series of events, though, is that Drew Pearson, despite having known communist sympathizers on his actual staff, he was never investigated by the House Un-American Committee, and getting into a fight with the very senator who led the Red Scare tactics of the 1950s, he was never investigated. In fact, he was saved by Richard Nixon in his little fist fight with Joseph McCarthy. We have many images, though, that show Drew Pearson meeting with subsequent U.S. President Lyndon Johnson. So what exactly is going on here? It's very hard to say. Why wasn't Drew Pearson ever more stringently investigated? Why was a journalist allowed to run around and seemingly dictate U.S. policy? Back to James Forrestal, he ran into other issues when he continued to challenge the policies of President Truman and President Truman's failure to fund the armed forces. Indeed, the United States Armed Forces were left in a very state of depreciation after World War II. Now, it makes sense that there was a reduction in forces that followed, and yet at the same time, there seemed to be an awareness of the threat. In the presidential election of 1948, James Forrestal had made an arrangement with Thomas Dewey, the man running against President Truman, that he would continue on as Secretary of Defense under a Dewey administration. Indeed, many political pundits at the time believed that Dewey was going to defeat Truman, but in fact the opposite occurred. Well, the story, of course, was leaked out by Forrestal's friend Pearson, and Truman asked him to resign immediately. And thus was the end of perhaps the most effective Secretary of Defense that the United States Department of Defense ever had, the subsequent Secretary of Defenses having a very mixed reputation at best. James Forrestal was hospitalized because of the overwork and pressure, at least that's what the official story says, and one of his treatments was to prescribe sedatives. He held himself to a high standard of discipline, and many people say he had burned himself out. And yet the treatment at what is today Walter Reed, an institution that is certainly not short in controversy, especially in its treatment of veterans during the height of the American conflict in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Unfortunately, Forrestal is stated to have jumped out of a window and committed suicide, or at least fallen to his death. Forrestal was succeeded by this man, Lewis Johnson, who became Secretary of Defense after Forrestal was asked to resign. Lewis Johnson carried out Truman's directive to continue to reduce the forces of the United States military and not carry out proper funding. This left the United States military in a very poor state of readiness by the start of the 1950s. It should also be noted there was a conflict of interest with Lewis Johnson, as he was a board member of the company that procured and was awarded the contract to develop the B-36 bomber. The B-36 bomber, considered a billion-dollar blunder, as it was a propeller-driven bomber in which the Soviet and Communist forces were armed with the MiG-15, the first jet-powered fighter. Therefore, the B-36, despite all the development costs being spent on it, was already obsolete by the time it rolled off of the tarmac. And indeed, it played virtually no effective role in the Korean War and was quickly retired from service by 1959, having no use. We'll also take a look at the change in the United States military, looking at the overall number of personnel from 1940 going to 400,000, over 12 million at the height of World War II, and then by 1950 reduced to 1.5 million. It should also be noted that many units were totally under-equipped, lacking heavy weapons, tanks, and armor, and this would play a terrifying role on the effectiveness of the U.S. military in responding to the Korean conflict in 1950. And suddenly Truman found that he did not have an effective military to respond to the invasion of South Korea by North Korea. And indeed, this nearly led to total defeat, as not only was the Republic of Korean Army pushed back to the south, but the UN forces, namely the U.S. Army and other supporting elements, were quickly trapped in the Pusan perimeter. There were many units that lacked heavy equipment, tanks, and even effective anti-tank fighting capabilities. It was only after the North Koreans had finally outrun their lines of logistics that the UN forces were able to build up an effective presence in South Korea and counterattack effectively. The United States military paid a heavy price, though, for being completely unprepared, and how many soldiers and service members died who didn't have to die. It's quite a condemnation when we look at what was warned at by James Forrestal, and he seemed to be prescient in a lot of ways. And yet, unfortunately, for his efforts, he died. And yet, very few people actually question what was really going on with James Forrestal, and yet have no questions that there's no historical anomalies with what he was really trying to stand for, even though he was proven right by the subsequent events. What are your thoughts on James Forrestal? From 1945 to 1949, the United States held a nuclear monopoly over all the lands. The United States was the first nation to develop a nuclear weapon, and therefore it had a nuclear monopoly at the end of World War II. Now, what exactly did the United States achieve with its nuclear monopoly? The development of the nuclear weapon was considered one of the end-all be-all goals of all nations in World War II. There was a great fear that the Axis powers were going to develop the atom bomb first, or the wonder weapon as it was called. There was much effort devoted, especially by the Germans, to the development of the weapon. However, the United States Manhattan Project and many of its leading scientific figures enabled them to develop and detonate the first test nuclear weapon. As a result of the fact that the United States was the only nation that had the technology of nuclear fission that would eventually be developed into nuclear fusion, the splitting and the amalgamation of the atom, this led to the ability of developing weapons with tremendous explosive yields. Explosive yields that were enough to level cities and destroy nations. And certainly the United States was the first nation to be aware of the destructive potential of nuclear weapons. Finally, humanity, in its long quest for destroying itself with weapons of mass destruction, had succeeded in its goal. And certainly since the United States had been the first nation to develop and test these weapons, it had to know better than anybody the destructive potential of nuclear weapons. The situation at the end of World War II was the Axis had been defeated, but now it was the East against the West, capitalism against communism. The official history tells us that the Soviet Union had a long-standing rivalry with the United States. Indeed, the United States had intervened during the Russian Civil War at the end of World War I. It's often not mentioned that American troops participated in numerous expeditions to the Soviet Union, or Russia at the time, to try to prevent the collapse of the White Russians, or the Russians that supported the imperial family. There are numerous well-documented images of these expeditions that show foreign forces in many major Russian cities: the United States, Great Britain, Japan, even a foreign legion from the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia, participated in the area. And here you can see an image of that Czechoslovakian legion. So it seems as though Russia definitely had reason to be xenophobic, as their nation had been invaded by virtually every other allied nation at the end of World War I. So we can understand why Russia, now the Soviet Union at the end of World War II, would fear a nuclear-armed United States. And yet at the same time, one would expect that since the United States was the only nation in the land, in the world, in 1945 that had nuclear weapons, that it would be able to achieve essentially any sort of foreign policy goals that it would want, as there is no nation that could possibly match it. And here we have an image of American troops in Vladivostok. So what exactly happened? We know how everything turned out, that the Soviet Union was able to develop its own atomic bomb in 1949, but that was still 4 years that the United States was the only nuclear-armed nation in the land. So what did the United States do with its nuclear monopoly, as it were? Well, it seems as though it really didn't do much of anything. In fact, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which many debated were unnecessary, as the entry of the Soviet Union into World War II would have forced Japan to surrender anyway. But regardless of whether it was necessary or not, those bombings were supposed to be a demonstration to the Soviet Union of the destructive potential of these weapons. And yet, oddly enough, the Soviet Union seemed to proceed very aggressively with its foreign policy, managing to entrench itself in Eastern Europe and across the lands. And the United States seemed quite powerless to respond, despite the fact that at the end of World War II it had the largest military, and it was also the only armed nuclear power in the world. And yet it was outmaneuvered politically and diplomatically by the Soviet Union in many situations. And we saw how, looking at the James Forrestal story, how that led to the conflict in Korea. And indeed, the United States military was caught in a very unfortunate position of not being prepared for that conflict. At the same time, there was the Berlin blockade. Berlin was divided at the end of World War II, and it stood deep within what would become East Germany. The Soviet Union decided to turn up political pressure, and it cut off the land corridors and logistics of the Western powers supporting their forces and the people of West Berlin. Instead of answering with an escalation of force or even a threat of a nuclear deterrent, the United States simply executed the Berlin airlift in conjunction with the other Western Allied powers at the time, and managed to supply the citizens of West Berlin and their forces accordingly with an airlift. Isn't it interesting, though, that the United States did not simply respond by saying that with the imposition of the Berlin blockade, that they would simply respond with nuclear weapons? The Soviet Union did not possess any nuclear weapons at that time. The United States could have simply bombed Soviet cities until they had capitulated. Now that might seem like that's very ruthless, but yet this was the same president who had authorized the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to begin with. So what exactly had happened to President Truman? Why didn't he approach a more hawkish stance, or at least a nuclear deterrent? Did Harry S. Truman's old mentor, Tom Pendergast, not prepare him for the realities of diplomacy and actual foreign policy? It's rather insane to think of the fact that there was a nuclear-armed nation that was the only nation in the world that was outmaneuvered politically by its greatest rival. And indeed, it seems as though Harry Truman didn't really seem to consider that there was any other alternative. He simply always looked for the least aggressive response. It's almost as though there was something else going on. But what do you think? Why was it the United States was not able to achieve more with its nuclear monopoly? Instead, what we had was a Cold War that lasted for nearly 40 years, with the world at the brink of nuclear annihilation. Certainly, Harry S. Truman had to have been advised by that, and most certainly, there should have been a stronger U.S. response to the attempts of development of an atomic bomb by the Soviet Union. But what are your thoughts on this? Let me know in the comments. What's the real true story? Nuclear war avoided 1949 until now. The prospect of a full-scale nuclear exchange or a nuclear holocaust was a terror that the world faced for 4 or 5 decades, and many would say that we're still facing this horrific existential threat. A terrifying destruction of all the lands by unleashing nuclear weapons, with 2 fully armed nuclear powers facing off at each other, and with the slightest provocation, they could destroy the world, in the length of a lazy afternoon, as Carl Sagan would say. And we had many different specters of nuclear conflict. The possibility that a slight misunderstanding, a commander who misinterpreted something that happened, or even a computer glitch, could unleash the great forces of Armageddon. The power of nuclear weapons is very terrifying. The fact that a single nuclear weapon could completely destroy a city, or even more. Nuclear weapons reached yields of 50 megatons, the Tsar Bomba, the largest one ever tested by the Soviet Union. Most of the nuclear warheads were not quite as large in explosive yield, and yet many were built. We're told that at the height of the Cold War there were over 60,000 nuclear warheads in service. And the whole point of so many nuclear warheads was there was supposed to be a pancaking attack. In other words, they would spread out as many nuclear detonations over the widest surface area that they could. What it would lead to is a total destruction of the land and the unleashing of a nuclear winter. There were also numerous films that we looked at in our live stream Until the End of the World, where we considered the nuclear scare films Threads, The Day After, and there's been many others, including When the Wind Blows. And in all these films, we're told that there is simply no hope to survive a nuclear exchange. Everyone and everything would die. And not only would it die, but it would die very slowly and very terribly. It would be the true situation where the living would envy the dead. It would be a literal hell on earth. Just the very prospect of the mushroom cloud terrified generations for many decades. And yet, despite all the odds indicating that there should have been some sort of nuclear exchange, somehow it was always averted. This terrifying reality, this horrific destiny, was always avoided. And how exactly was that possible? There's been some statisticians who attempted to calculate what the odds were of a nuclear exchange not occurring, given the situation that we were given during the Cold War. 2 fully armed nuclear powers with intercontinental ballistic missiles that land-launched could reach each other's cities within 20 minutes. If they were launched by submarines that were closer, 6 minutes. And we have no shortage of the incredibly terrifying nuclear footage of all the tests, and the very durable cameras that were employed to record these tests, showing these strategic and tactical nuclear weapons detonating. There were also well-documented historical examples, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, where World War III, or nuclear war, almost transpired. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, with the basing of medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba by the Soviet Union. This showed a very terrifying threat that the United States had to respond to. And isn't it intriguing that a lot of this equipment was simply left out to be easily photographed? And it's most certain that the Soviets and the Cubans knew that this equipment could easily be photographed. And yet this led to a very distinct increase in tensions in the Cold War, almost leading to a full-scale preemptive strike by the United States. Fortunately, the president and cooler heads prevailed, and they went with a mere policy of containment, blockading Cuba until all the warheads and delivery systems were removed, which they were. But this wasn't the only situation. There was also the Able Archer exercise in 1983. Able Archer was a full-scale military and political exercise carried out by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to prepare for a nuclear war. The only issue with it was the rehearsal was so realistic that the Soviets believed that NATO was actually preparing for a preemptive strike on Soviet forces, and as a result, they increased the alert status of their own nuclear forces accordingly. Very frightening and terrifying display to realize that a mere exercise brought about World War III and a total nuclear exchange. There was also the statement that the KGB knew exactly what NATO was up to at all times, and yet conflicting accounts indicate that they did not, that the Soviet Union very nearly responded to Able Archer 83. There's also the consideration that at any point in time, many unstable commanders on either side of the so-called Iron Curtain could have initiated a nuclear strike on their own recognizance without any oversight. And then there's also the possibility of a computer glitch or some sort of malfunction, whether it's presenting a phantom attack on a computer screen or it's simply a pre-programmed attack in the event of a fail-safe being triggered. Whatever the case, for whatever reason, we somehow managed to avoid nuclear exchange until today, and we continue to avoid it every single day that we continue to go on. But what's the real reason for it? What are your thoughts? How exactly was a full-scale nuclear conflict avoided for the decades of the Cold War, and even until now? One of the most stunning achievements that we have revealed in history is the ability of the United States Navy to construct so many ships in a short period of time. We've considered other tremendous logistical achievements in other explorations, but we haven't looked at this particular achievement. Keep in mind that when the United States Navy embarked upon this shipbuilding program, this was at the start of World War II. And yet when we look at the U.S. Navy active ship force levels from the History of the Navy military website itself, we can see that from 1938, the total active ships in the United States Navy went from 380 to simply 6 years later being 6,084. And really the most dramatic increases being from 1941 to 1944. In a 3-year period of time, this force increased well over 7-fold. An unbelievable increase in the number of ships. How were so many ships built in such a short period of time? It seems as though the United States' unlimited industrial capacity was brought to bear, that they were able to rapidly train a new entire workforce, as many of the trained individuals had gone off to join the military. Although we know that in World War II, it being a strategic war, the organization of the use of labor was completely different. Yet isn't it fascinating that this was achieved by a nation from 1941 to 1944 that just a few years earlier couldn't even feed its own people or provide employment and was in a total depression? Isn't it quite a stark contrast? Now, we're not questioning that. It's just quite an amazing consideration when you think about it, that just a few short years earlier, the entire nation was in a Great Depression, and then because of the advent of war, it quickly switched to a war economy and was able to build many of these ships. Indeed, look at the fleet carriers. These are the largest capital ships in the United States Navy. And from 1942, granted, there were losses that were occurring as the United States entry into World War II started with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Although fortuitously none of the carriers were caught in Pearl Harbor, it merely involved battleships. We can see how quickly the fleet carrier strength increased from 7 to 25 in 3 years. And that was with combat losses as well to the Imperial Japanese Navy. We also look at the escort carriers going from 1 in 1941 to 65 in 1944. Now keep in mind, these are just actual combat ships or support ships for the U.S. Navy. We're not talking about all the cargo ships or the Liberty ships that the United States managed to build. The total amount of ships is staggering. But we do have some images of what post-World War II looked like when many of these ships were put in the mothball. And here we can see several escort carriers, numerous other support ships, so many ships filling the entire port. It's a staggering and tremendous achievement that the United States was able to achieve this kind of shipbuilding output in just a few short years. And yet we have other images that show this. Just unbelievable in terms of how many ships they were able to build in such a short amount of time. And we can see many other images of these mothballed fleets, which include all types of ships, whether it's carriers, cruisers, destroyers. Even in this image here, we can see a little bit of everything. We have what looks to be an escort carrier. We have some light cruisers, other escort carriers. Just an impressive amount of ships. Consider all the materials that went into this. Consider training the labor force to be able to rapidly construct all these ships. And then not to mention, even the impressive expansion of the United States Navy to rapidly train and crew all of these ships. And then at the same time, to recall what happened with the complete disarmament of the United States military at the end of World War II to find itself unprepared to conduct the war in Korea initially. So, what's your take on this entire situation? Was this just something that merely involved tremendous organization, and the United States was able to achieve this? I mean, we know the United States achieved this. It is indeed very well documented, and it's very well documented that the United States seemed to disarm itself as fast as it could and did not take advantage of its nuclear monopoly and found itself in a grave disadvantage in the Korean conflict. But what are the real explanations for all these outcomes? And what are your thoughts on this sort of exploration, looking at some rather strange events that really did occur in history? Well, thank you for joining me.